Good afternoon. Welcome to today's meeting of CS Bars. At this time, I ask that roll be called to establish a quorum.
Michael Clancy,
Present.
Jim Efting, absent. Linda Keller,
Present.
George Leal,
Present.
Kevin Marshall,
Present.
thank you. Jessica Park,
Present.
we have a quorum.
Thank you. So we'll now open the floor for public comments. Just a reminder that public comments are limited to 2 minutes. If you already signed up, then we will have you on the list. If not, and you are here, you may raise your hand via Zoom, or if you're on the phone, you can raise and lower your hand using *9. Now I will ask staff to recognize anyone making public comment at this time.
Thank you, Dean Keller. We did not have advanced signups. I did see a hand from Marty Pritikin. So Devin, if you would recognize Marty Pritikin, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Great, thank you. So I want to comment on the proposed fee increase, particularly on the proposed increase for the fee for Cal-accredited schools. And I really wanted to raise a number of questions. The first would be, why were there only the 2 options of raising it from approximately 23% or about 1,100%? Why there was no middle ground suggested? Trying to understand why it would be reasonable to increase the fees in 1 year to more than 10 times what they are currently. I actually checked the ABA schedule of fees, and the fee that's being proposed for Cal-accredited schools is actually exactly what the ABA charges for schools that are in the enrollment range of 400 to 600. The point of Cal accreditation in part is supposed to be to have some more flexible regulation that makes law school more affordable for students, and I don't know if that contributes to that. I also wanted to know why there wasn't a proposal for tiers of fees, just like the Cal State Bar does have for unaccredited schools, and like the ABA itself has. And my final question would be, what is being done to move towards the regime of the deemed accredited status, which was approved in the rule package 4 years ago, whose intent, I believe, was to try to reduce the amount of oversight that the State Bar needed to engage in, which would enable them to reduce costs and possibly make it feasible to not raise fees as much as being proposed, but yet also not have to cut necessary services. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you. I don't see anyone else for public comment. Natalie, is there anyone that you see?
Yes, we do have an additional comment from Sandra Brooks, please.
Great, thanks.
There, am I unmuted?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Thank you, guys. I'd like to also address the proposed increase to the CAL's annual report and inspection fees. In line with my colleague, Dean Pritikin, I'll address the annual report fee first. Option 1 is said to reflect a break-even approach, the true cost of providing each service. I'd like to know how that true cost of staff reviewing the CAL's annual reports can possibly be $22,900, a 955% increase from our current fee right now. This increase is unconscionable. The CALs pride themselves on providing quality, affordable legal education, and an increase of this size will most likely have to be passed on to our students, your consumers. For my program, that will mean an additional cost of over $2,000 per student to complete their JD. CAL's tuition and fees are a fraction of the ABA's, and we'd like to keep it that way. Second, the inspection fee. Annually, CALs pay a mandatory partial prepayment towards its 5-year inspection. Option 1 increases the cost of that inspection visit to $40,000. Option 2 increases it to $30,000. Cal Northern's last inspection in 2018 actually cost $26,300. Effective in January of 22, with the new rule changes to the accredited law schools, Rule 4147 provides a law school that's been fully accredited by the committee and also fully accredited by any accreditor recognized by the Department of Education may apply to be jointly accredited by the committee. And a jointly accredited law school is not subject to periodic inspection unless a complaint has been filed or the committee has a reasonable belief the law school may be out of compliance. Approximately half the CALs are accredited by the regional accreditor WASC and have been waiting since January of 2022 for the opportunity to apply to be considered jointly accredited. When asked, staff reports they haven't had time to draft an application for us to complete. Once jointly accredited and not subject to periodic inspections, which should reduce state bar costs, how can the state bar justify an increase in the prepayment fees? And if they do, the least they can do is limit the total prepayment fee to the actual amount of one inspection. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Is there any other public comment at this time?
So sorry, I was taking notes from the public comment, but there is no further public comment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So then let us move on to approval of the March 22nd, 2023 CS BAR's meeting minutes. Were there any suggested changes or corrections after review? Okay, seeing none from our committee members, is there a motion to approve the minutes from the March 22nd meeting?
This is Michael Clancy. I read the minutes. I make a motion that they be approved.
Okay, thank you. Do we have a second for that motion?
Kevin Marshall, and I second that motion.
Thank you. Okay. There's no further discussion, then we'll move to a vote.
Michael Clancy,
Aye.
Jim Eftein, absent. Linda Keller,
Aye.
George Leal. George Leal,
I said aye.
thank you. Kevin Marshall,
Aye.
Jessica Park,
Aye.
with 5 yeses and 0 nos, the motion passes.
Okay, thank you. In terms of the chair's report, just a couple of quick notes. First, just a reminder of the CBE meeting is on Friday, and the agenda and some of the materials have been posted online. I'm sure more will be posted between now and Friday morning. Also, just want to make a note about today's agenda for future reference. You may notice that prior discussion item with regard to best practices for the preservation of student records, particularly transcripts, is not on today's agenda. We will come back to that item after staff has had a chance to consult with BPPE as suggested at our last meeting, and we can continue our discussion at that time. With that, I will ask Natalie Leonard and Audrey Ching to start us off with the staff reports.
Thank you. And Devin, I'll ask you to please recognize our guests, Lawrence Liao and Andrew Conover from the Finance Department, who are in the audience, and then I'll turn it over to Audrey.
Thank you. Sorry, I was afraid I just muted myself, but I did not. So from the public comment, it appears that folks have already seen the fee proposal increase that is out there. I emailed our entire list that I have of our deans and other administrators last week to make sure that everyone's aware. And I hope with the public comment today that people are clicking through and submitting their written public comment for the admissions fee proposals as well. So one of the public comment that we just received, hopefully Andrew and Lawrence can help to explain how we came to the assessment of the structural deficit that we're facing in admissions. There's a lot of background on the links that we sent through to you last week, but basically the fees don't cover the expenses. I mean, that is why we need to look at raising fees and cutting costs. So admissions is also going through a lot of cost cutting exercises. The whole state bar is going through some austerity measures with vacancies and salary savings as well. So it's not just fee increases, it's also cutting our costs operationally as well. So a lot of our fees haven't increased in a very long time. Some of the ones that have increased most recently were pre-pandemic 2016. So the cost of doing business has just increased. There are two options that was alluded to during public comment, the break-even option one, and then another option on all the fee proposals, not just the ones in law school regulation that may seem more palatable, that are not quite as high a percentage of increasing fees from one year to the next. Not just the law school regulation fees, but hopefully everyone is letting their students and alumni know that there are costs proposed for like our exam fees. We're looking at different increasing the amount that attorneys pay for moral character application, for the bar exam application. So hopefully everyone's read through all the different options. And if you have not, you have time. The public comment closes on May 15th. Am I covering anything, Natalie?
No, I think that's perfect. And I'm very glad that we've been able to bring Lawrence and also Andrew. Andrew was present to work on the fee proposal the last time the fees were reviewed for law schools back in 2017. He was part of that review, and ultimately the fees that were adopted were fees that did not cover costs at that time back in 2017. And the bar has been subsidizing the fees since then. But given the current structural deficit position, that is not possible going forward. And they can talk a little bit about the proposal. And I'm very glad that we've been able to have Andrew's longtime perspective on this as well. So with that, I'll introduce them to just give a high-level overview of the process that they went through.
Okay, good afternoon. I was involved in the study a little over 5 years ago, where we looked at the cost to provide the services for this particular program. And fees were raised starting 2018, I believe, and that's when the prepayment for the CALs began as well, as a way to sort of regulate the year-to-year differences. So we used the same process that we did the 5 years ago. Lawrence and I from finance started this process last spring. We looked at the total cost, which included salaries, the benefits to the employees that were in this area, the external cost for the consultants and the other external contractors that this program used, as well as a portion of the amount of indirect costs that is borne by every state bar department, which includes departments such as finance, IT, HR, general building services. And certainly those costs have only continued to go up over the last 5 years. And the option number one that was commented on in the opening reflects the true cost of providing the services, not what you may have been billed for your last inspection or your last annual report. So the option one does reflect that break-even point, and the option two is something less than that, with the knowledge that there would still be some subsidies that would need to continue if that was selected.
Thank you. And for the benefit of the members of the public, we've attached the public comment link, which you can also access directly from the State Bar's website. When proposals are posted for a public comment, They are up on the public comment page. You can see the background for each topic, including the fee proposals, and there's a public comment form that you can use. You can submit comments of any length, and they will be able to be reviewed by the Board of Trustees before considering the item. So we have received some public comments already, and we encourage you to submit more as well. Any member of the public may comment, whether staff member, student, etc., and we welcome your feedback. Okay, any other questions? I'll turn it back to you, Dean Keller. It looks like
I see Dean Park with their hand raised, actually.
So I was going to say, Dean Park, go ahead and start us off.
Oh, no worries. I appreciate that there was an email sent out to let people know about the public comment period. That's something I've been sharing with staff or with students, since they're the ones that they may already have some of the Office of Admission fees through registration, but they might be budgeting ahead for any potential changes to fees. My question was, with the upcoming Committee of Bar Examiners agenda, I took a quick look through there. Is there a way that this is going to be a meeting where more is covered about this topic that could help inform those who are thinking over what comments they may make?
Was it just the last meeting, Andrew? We went through it in March. So I would
January
say
and March on the CBE, yes, and then
Okay.
last year it went to the Board Finance Committee, some preliminary work that Lawrence and I had done, and I believe that was May. So
but
there
all
are-
those recordings are posted, Dean Park. You can go, or they can not have to watch the whole thing, but watch the relevant part about the fee proposal and how we came to those numbers. Yeah, it's all up on the website.
No, thank you. I have had some tech issues, so I had not seen some of the recordings or gone through all of them. So thank you for that.
And for those members of the public who might not have used the recordings before, if you go to the agenda page where you found the agenda for today's meeting, at the top you can not only find the link for the archives to the paper, e-paper agendas, you can also find the links to the meeting recordings as well.
Thank you. I did want to just circle back to a couple of things that were raised in public comment that I think may be of interest to everyone. So one of the questions has been addressed a little bit, but I wonder if we could dig a little deeper in terms of explaining how the cost of the of reviewing one school's annual report winds up being almost $23,000.
Yeah, Andrew, I think I'll take a stab at this and chime in whenever you want. So one of the things that we did was, when we started this exercise last spring, was looking at our budget that we had set forth for 2022 as a starting point, and then we would engage the Office of Admissions with their knowledge and expertise on looking at the expenses on a program basis. So, for instance, just specifically for this, for the law schools and for other programs, and we were able to, for instance, to allocate the time for each personnel spent on working on all the different programs, and that was for the headcount portion or the personnel portion. That's how that was the methodology that we used to determine that piece of the cost. And then just to go ahead a little bit, when we completed our 23 budget, we had then updated those costs, and obviously, year over year, those personnel costs do increase for whether it's merit increases or changes in salaries, promotions, or some kind of COLA adjustment and that sort of thing, right? So every year those costs are going to go up. And then on the non-personnel costs, right, we start with our budget and we look at all the external costs, whether it's contractors or consultants or even like computer software that should improve efficiency and that sort of thing, right? To look at that cost and then spread it over, allocate it appropriately over all the programs based on the inputs from the admissions team, right? Obviously, they are they know best how their organization is designed and run. And then that's kind of the basis in how we looked at the cost. It was very granular, and it was on a program basis, and we looked at each budget and then was able to allocate to each program. So that's the basis in which we looked at and assessed the total cost.
And so Dean Keller, part of what might help with that is that when we do the budgeting for educational standards in the bar, the costs really are divided into two categories: annual report and then inspection. And so inspection costs are related directly to the inspection or issues that flow from inspection or identified non-compliance. And then the other costs go to annual report, with the idea that the annual report is the main means that we use to monitor compliance throughout the year. But there are other things that we do, some of which did not exist when we did the 2017 fee reviews, such as the MPR calculation with the PLP adjustments, verifying that, the audits related to the 6061 form, which was brand new at the time the last review happened, the addition of questions that we get, just as you probably have received an increase in questions during the pandemic. So have we, as the options and choices available for programs at the CALs and other schools have increased, the number of questions we receive and that we monitor have increased. And all of those costs are booked against the annual report versus the others booked against the inspection. So that might be some helpful perspective.
Okay, so just so I make sure I'm following you. So annual report is not limited to review of the annual report. It's essentially a label for the annual report plus all of the other expenses that are not related to the inspection of school.
So the overall monitoring. Yes.
Okay, so it's put forth as an annual report fee, but it's really the CAL's program expenses overall. Is that accurate?
I would say so, yeah. And it's been that way for many, many years.
Okay, thank you. Dean Mail, go ahead.
Thank you, Dean Keller. Yeah, to assist in the public comment made today by two of the CAL's deans, and in the spirit of transparency, the question I've got is going forward is I know anecdotally that during COVID, of course, that most site inspections were done virtually on Zoom. And I'm assuming, although that's my first question, is what's the format, or what would a team look like going out to inspect any of the CALs going forward now that they would, I would assume, have on-site inspections? Back in the day, it was a fairly regular occurrence where you would have a three-person team with staff, a member of the committee, and then a visiting dean from a non-competing CALs. And if I remember correctly, I think that is not that requirement to have a dean now, or even a member of the committee, may be discretionary in terms of any particular site inspection. So I hope to assist those providing further and future public comment when it comes to the expense of future inspections. I mean, what is staff looking at toward how would schools be inspected going forward? Is it going to be a hybrid where one or two members of an inspection team might appear or participate only virtually on Zoom, or partially on Zoom and partially on campus? The old days of 3-day inspections with 3 team members was an expensive exercise in terms of lodging, meals, transportation. So I think to help the CALs going forward, or to help everybody, would be helpful to know what would a typical CALS inspection be in terms of membership of the team and the form of their participation.
Thanks, Dean Leal. That's a good point. And that is something that we are looking at in general. And you are correct that in the past, when a team went on site, the travel costs were billed at cost to the schools. And to the extent that travel is reduced, then that element of the inspection will be reduced too. We are all coming out of the post-COVID world, the emergency finally being sunsetted in May. And so that's something that we're looking at going forward. We're also looking at what is the best format for schools now offering mixed modality teaching in a way that was not available generally before the pandemic, and what's the best way to monitor. So that's something that's evolving. Dean Leal, you may be on mute. Oh, I'm not
Yeah,
able to.
yeah,
Perfect.
yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't realize I muted myself. Well, going forward, perhaps at a future meeting of CS bars, would we be able to see what the proposals will be going forward in the structure and the conduct of site inspections and, estimated costs associated with future inspections in a post-COVID environment?
Thanks, Dean Liu. Yeah, I've made a note of that.
Great, thank you. Dean Clancy?
Yes, I have a question that is focused on one of the public comments given, the one that was given by Dean Pritikin. He asked whether or not the bar has considered a tiered fee structure so that some of the smaller schools would pay arguably less than what those schools that have a larger student populace. That seems to me to be something that should be a concern because some schools don't have much in the way of a student population. And for those schools that, for instance, are involved in teach outs, and that will happen over time, I'm sure, the student population will decrease, probably to the point where paying the annual fee would be really quite a struggle. One way or the other, the reality is that when costs go up, prices go up, and students in the end will have to pay for the cost increase. So my question is about whether or not the tiered structure was considered. And secondly, I just wanted to express concern over the fact that ultimately the cost of tuition will no doubt increase because of the increase in the annual fee if we go with option one.
So we didn't, I don't know if I'm missing anything, Andrew and Lawrence, but we didn't look at a tiered
No,
approach for the
we reviewed the existing tiered structure for the registered in the same classes, but the CALs as they were 5 years ago. No change in that.
Yeah, historically, there hasn't been a tiered proposal before. That doesn't mean it's not something that could be looked at now.
I do want to make a note that if you tier the fees and for smaller schools, and if the goal is to try to manage the gap back to a positive standpoint, that's just going to require us to I guess inequitably raise fees on the bigger schools, right? Just to point that out, if that's the goal, right? So I think the way it's structured now, it's pretty even across the board. So if you're going to have it tiered, and if the goal is still to manage that deficit that we've got going on, then it's going to also put some pressure on the larger schools at perhaps a higher price.
Dean Clancy, did you have anything further, or is your hand still up from your prior question?
It's still up because of the prior question. I will take it down. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. So I'm wondering, in terms of whether it's the annual report or ancillary costs, what sort of collaboration can there be between staff and the schools to try to make things more efficient? I mean, one has already been brought up. If it was, say, remote or hybrid visits, that would obviously cut costs in terms of inspections. But I'm wondering in terms of whether it be the annual report or other processes.
I think several things. What I would encourage the most for schools is communication with prospective students, with current students, etc. And the State Bar is here to provide what we can to help you in that mission, because if we can provide what you need in a format that's easier for you to create without following up, that helps us. If we can help you to inform and you can inform students, and it reduces the overall questions without compromising the information that the students need, those I think would have the largest impact on what we could reduce together. And I think it would be great for us to continue to brainstorm in that way too.
Thank you. Dean Park?
I just had a question about the bar exam options between option one and option two. And I know that the bar exam is in person. moving forward, and the first year law students examination is online. Just in terms of being informed about the true cost behind option one, I see the 1,850 for application to the first year law students examination, which is 3 times the current fee. And I was curious if there was something for people to know in terms of, are we finding out the remote modality of doing the first year law students exam is like 300% more expensive than doing it in person? Or I can see the increase, of course, in true cost for the bar exam, right? It went from 677 to option one, 878, but it's not nearly as dramatic as the first year law students examination, which I'm aware is a much smaller group of people, typically from smaller size schools. So just, any transparency about that.
Well, I think similar to all the fees, it's not just the direct cost of the exam administration, it's all the eligibility work, all the other work that goes into all the exemptions, looking at the first year by staff. So the vendor itself and the cost of the exam, although the more secure live remote proctoring is more expensive than the record and review style. But and again, Andrew and Lawrence can correct me, but we're looking not just at the direct cost of the exam, but all the costs related to the first year.
I think another element with the first year is also the overall reduction in the number of students taking the first year.
Mhm.
And so the fixed cost of creating and putting on the exam remains similar, but the overall number of students taking the
That's a
exam
really good
is
point.
reduced.
We have the developers, the exam development, the exam grading, some of those costs that go into creation of our own exam.
Got it. And I'm very grateful actually to have been part of a volunteer group related to that. So that was a wonderful experience. Really appreciate it. Just a thought, and I'm not trying to complicate it, but if some of the true costs related to, let's say, the first year law students examination comes from exam development,
Mhm.
when the bar exam potentially changes in the future, is this true cost that's evaluated? I'm sure it was retroactive. Let's say the bar begins to develop its own exam more for the California bar exam. Do we expect this true cost to kind of reflect the research of what that may be in the future? So it might come closer to the first year law students examination in terms of true costs compared to today. So if you're including exam development right into it, like what we're looking at today is option one for the bar exam student application. It's a certain amount, but should the California bar exam shift in how that exam develops? Okay, just wanted to be sure. And again, I think I totally understand how things can be listed under different budget titles and items. So it really does help to have the opportunity to talk about that. So thank you.
And the important thing to point out is that Lawrence and I had to look, because we did this study twice. We did it last year based on last year's expenses, and then we did it again in January looking at the adopted budget. And so we're always looking backwards on what the costs are. So certainly as the model changes in the future, as you alluded to, those costs are hard to speculate what they'll be. They may go up, they may go down. A review in a couple of years from now will reflect what that, how close we were to meeting that target, and other costs may rise up, and other economies of scale may actually reduce, and so it may net out at the end of that. So we've had to look backwards, at least as expenses, and only as forward as much as the 2023 adopted budget.
Thank you.
Dean Mail.
Yes, my question relates kind of a perception issue. When I looked at the fee increases, of course, they were surprising and startling in some regards, but having listened to the committee's in-depth discussion in this last meeting, I certainly appreciate what's being done and why. But what really surprised me was because it was inconsistent with a number of comments made by committee members, was the fees charged, proposed fees to be charged to out-of-state attorneys registering to take the California bar exam, and some of the other programs that really benefit people, out-of-state attorneys who are coming in to practice, and that's fine. But from a perception angle. It honestly doesn't look really good, at least as I read it or saw it, where particularly when you're talking about fees charged to the CALs and registered schools, you're almost exclusively talking about California residents who are working to become licensed California attorneys versus people coming from out of state. So if I didn't do the math, but the increase is directed toward out-of-state attorneys who are either seeking to become licensed or actually will be able in a limited way to practice law here in California. Didn't seem to be commensurate with the kind of increases that we saw throughout the rest of the chart relating to and how they affected primarily law students and applicants to the bar exam. So was there much, if any, discussion? Well, I guess the question is to increase those fees even more so than they have been?
Well, let me take a first stab at this. I believe the short answer is the cost to those other programs for out-of-state attorneys were less for the bar as far as staff and benefits that were allotted to those programs. So they were raised, in some cases raised more than possibly to break even, but because they cost the bar that much less, that they were kept within those parameters. They weren't. The out-of-state attorneys were subsidized at a rate to offset some of the internal California-based programs.
Okay, so I want to remind everyone that the proposals will remain posted through May 15th. I greatly encourage you to take a look at them, spend some time with them, and to submit your public comments. And I want to thank you, Andrew and Lawrence, for joining us as well.
Yes, thank you. And Natalie or others, can you just remind us of exactly the procedure from here in terms of it's open for public comment and then who does what when in terms of the rest of the process?
Sure. So the public comment will be open through May 15. The mechanism for doing that is using the online public comment form that's on the page attached to the proposal. It's at the top of the page. And then at that point, it will return. And Audrey, can you remind me, will it return first to the Committee of Bar Examiners to review the public comment?
No.
And then proceed to the Board of Trustees?
To the board.
Directly to the board?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And then the board will consider it for modification or approval.
And do we know the date of that board consideration?
Let's see. I do not know the specific date. Do you know, Audrey, is it the May 19th board meeting?
That seems really fast for the turnaround, but I think it is. I think it's for the May board meeting, which is, yeah, so I think the turnaround is really very quickly for us to summarize and report back the comments.
But that May 18th meeting is to the Finance Committee.
Yeah.
It goes to the board 2 months after that.
Right. But they're gonna, we're gonna have to summarize and review the comments for the Finance Committee. Just thinking about the work days there, but that's okay.
Yeah.
So,
Nice.
so the Finance Committee meeting, is that open to the public?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So that's the first one up, and then it goes to the full
The
board
full board.
in July.
Yes.
Okay. Sometime in July. All right. Well,
And those meetings are posted. They're posted on the same place where you find these. They're remote meetings like this. You can attend the way audience members are attending here. They do have public comment at the beginning, like they do here. And in addition to the public comment on the form, which is actually where I would most encourage you to submit it as soon as possible, additional public comment is possible at the meeting.
okay. Thank you.
Okay, are we ready for recent developments?
Yes, there's nothing further on that. And yes, let's move on to recent developments.
Okay, I have just a few. The first one is a reminder that the Bar Strategies and Stories program is available for your graduates that are planning to take the July 23 bar exam. The team that we work with, the research team, was not able to make the program available for the February. program, but we're glad that it is back now. Some of your graduates may have signed up already when they registered for the bar exam. If they have not done so, there is still time. They will get customized email invitations as they did in the past. They must sign up from their own custom link, and they can register and be a part of that program. And as a reminder, that program is designed to be taken right at the beginning of their bar studies. So they can benefit from taking it at any time, but they're encouraged to take it immediately. It takes less than 2 hours. And we've seen very positive results from that program. So we are very glad to have it back. And we've been very glad to be able to fund the continued availability of that program. Any questions about that? Okay. All right, next topic. We also have the period open to apply to be on CS bars, or also as well as the Law School Council. CS bars focused on registered and accredited schools. Law School Council focused on staff at ABA schools. One thing that's new this year is that we have a new online application. So in the past, we did keep applications on file. We contacted those applicants to ask if they were still interested. If you've applied in the past, we encourage you to apply again, but we'd like to ask you to use the online form. So when you go to the CS bars page or the general appointment page, you can see that at the top. We encourage you to use that and to apply. For most of the other programs, the period is closing very soon, but for CS bars and Law School Council, that period will be open through June 30th. Again, we encourage you to apply sooner rather than waiting, but that time is there. And the new members will be appointed by the CBE chair and vice chair that will be named later this summer. So we just wanted to make you aware of that and encourage you to use that new online form and apply. Any questions about that? Okay, and then final note is we're going to ask for your help to pass along to your students the information that next week on the 24th of April, we'll be hosting the State Bar Day program. This has been a very popular program. We bring together people from different departments, leaders from different departments at the State Bar, talking about topics that are of interest to students. The program is optional. A student can be fully informed without attending the program, but it's a great opportunity to hear directly from leaders at the State Bar and to ask direct questions that are of a general nature and to find out where students can ask particular questions. It is a 90-minute webinar and there is a Q&A period as well. After this meeting, we will send something out using the usual bar exam list to all of you, everyone that's normally on there. It's also been sent to students. It's been tweeted out on the State Bar's Twitter as well. So we hope that all of your students who are available will be able to attend State Bar Day.
Okay, thank you. Any questions on that? All right, then that moves us on to our item for discussion today, looking at the current format of California Business and Professional Code 60617 disclosures. So for this, we want to think about what is the goal in looking at this format, and maybe Natalie can start off by kind of giving the framework and laying out the differences between different forms based on types of school.
Sure. Okay. And then I have some materials I can show, but I thought I'd just start with a verbal explanation, and then we can see if we want to use those or not. So this topic is part of the rules review that we're doing for both the accredited and unaccredited rules review. But this actually came from, thank you, Dean Leal here in our audience. Also, Dean Desi's at Pacific Coast University, and a question from our CBE chair, Paul Kramer. So among the various things that law schools do, both registered and accredited law schools post a disclosure each year on their websites pursuant to Business and Professions Code 6061.7a. This is set by statute, but there is some flexibility for the State Bar to choose what is included, and the State Bar creates a form in order to do that. So this was created back in 2017. During that time, the MPR, the minimum pass rate that accredited schools use, was on a suspended hiatus due to the state bar temporarily being unable to share pass lists at that time. So when the MPR came back, the forms were created as follows. The accredited forms, question number 8 at the bottom of the page, include the MPR for accredited schools. All accredited schools are required to maintain an MPR of 40% or more. We surveyed the unaccredited schools at that time to ask if they would be interested to show that figure. We did not get strong interest, and the unaccredited schools are not required to have any specific minimum pass rate. So what's posted for them is a calendar year, 5-year cumulative posting. So everyone who takes the bar during that period, what percentage of those pass the bar? So at a couple of recent committee meetings, a couple of deans, including Dean Leal and our CBE chair, noticed that we used 2 different bar passage rates. They wondered why, and they asked for some feedback about which is the correct to use. Is there one correct option to use, or might it be best to have several benchmarks? So I wanted to get some feedback on several different possibilities that could be considered going forward. The first one is just simply to get some feedback on how the accredited schools may feel about adding the MPR to their disclosure. And this means a couple of things. That number is rather complicated to calculate. It does take time, and it does take staff time. So referring back to the earlier discussion, if it's something that's adopted, if we're looking for ways to decrease costs, this is something that will increase a cost. But I maybe want to turn to Dean Leal to start, because I think that he has a really strong point of view about some of the pros of adding the MPR to the report.
Thank you, Natalie. Of course I do. But let me, if I may, just take a few seconds to sort of provide a little more context and why this is important and long overdue and very welcome to get some consistency. And this is probably an unintended result, but if the registered schools, mine included, accurately and rigorously use the formula as stated in the registered form, it really there's a very unfortunate flaw in the methodology, and that flaw is that when one of my graduates, or a graduate of my law school, who's been out of school more than 5 years, sometimes 6, 7, 8 years, decides, as they do from time to time, to take the bar exam again. And again, if we are all familiar with the basic fractional kind of formula, we have to count them, and do count them, in the denominator of our calculation. That is, that they took the exam within that 5-year period of time. Unlike the CALS rules and the NPR, which is very specific, that it's, and frankly, I think there's a obviously better way to apply this metric, is you only count, you have to have both graduated and taken the bar within the requisite 5-year time period. And so somebody coming back into that taking the exam, who've graduated 6, 7, 8 years ago, even if they pass, they don't get counted, or if they fail, more importantly, they don't get counted. The way the registered form works is we have to count them. We count them if they took and failed or passed the exam within the 5 years. So that is, I want to believe, having been, frankly, in full disclosure, responsible for the drafting of that form some years ago, I think was an oversight, and I hope one that we can correct here pretty quickly, because it has a dramatic impact on schools if they are doing it correctly, for registered schools. And in my case, and I've done the math several times, it's about a 20% difference between what prospective students would find when they find the form and look at our posted pass rate, not referred to as an NPR, but just the bar pass rate, and versus what it would be if we were able to not count the folks, and we have several who consistently take the bar and not pass, yeah, it would be about 20 points. And I would imagine that's consistent with other registered schools. So that is sort of the urgency or the motivation, let's say, to get the change. Now, to your point, Natalie, with regard to the benefits, I think it's helpful. I mean, it's an apples to apples comparison. If you think of it in terms of the free market, individuals looking at my school or Cal accredited school, you know, they should be given accurate, consistent and data that can correlate between the programs. And I think an essential metric to most applicants to law schools is bar pass rate. And I think to get consistency for all schools based upon the CALS rate, I think was obviously the best way to go. It's also, you know, a good test for registered schools in terms of, you know, working toward or maintaining what would be a compliant NPR if they were a Cal accredited school, the 40% rate. So, you know, it evens the playing field in terms of future applicants and students enrolled in either a Cal accredited program or registered program. It also sets the bar very clearly in terms of a registered school's status viewed toward a potential or future application for provisional and full accreditation. And it would be, I would imagine, you know, very helpful for registered deans, myself included, to, you know, be able to calculate accurately and then report a bar pass rate that is completely consistent with what the majority, what all Cal accredited schools. So that I think is my best case for making the change.
Mm-hmm. And then Dean Leal, I wonder if in your school, or if you know, if the schools collectively, I know that sometimes the schools have collaborated to share data, if there's information about takers and sort of the number of takers that are taking it more than over the 5-year period. Is that a large percentage at your school or across the unaccrediteds generally? So it's certainly something we could calculate, but I wonder if it's something that's been looked at so far.
Well, I mean, in my program, it has. I mean, again, I refer to it as the tyranny of small numbers. And I can give you a perfect example. You know, in our program, we had 2 graduates take the bar exam in 2022. One passed on his first try and one didn't. So we have a 50% first time pass rate, you know, one out of 2. And so if we have we do, you know, 1 or 2 graduates who graduated, you know, several years ago with such a small numerator and even a small denominator, but when they get added to the denominator, it has a very oversized impact on those results, as I've indicated. The other thing, and this is really drilling down into the weeds, is the registered schools don't get the benefit as CALS do, you know, because there's really an 11 administration rule when it comes to the CALS NPR. That is, even though, you know, students technically only have 10 administrations to pass, there's that 11th, you know, the folks that graduate very close to the deadline. Say they graduate in May of next year, would be what, 2022, I guess. And if they take and not pass the July 2022 exam, we all know they can take the February 2023 exam if they pass, having graduated within the 5-year period. Although they took the exam in 2023, they get counted. I mean, they get credited toward an NPR. So that's another unintended and really hidden flaw in the language used to calculate a registered school's bar pass rate, because it basically, maybe the flaw is in simplicity. It just says everyone who graduated and took the bar, you know, within those 5 years. And the NPR calculation, as some of you will remember, came about through very lengthy discussions, negotiations, and frankly, horse trading when it came to what that formula. And I think the end result has worked well. And I think there's consensus among all the CALS teams that it's an effective metric. It's you know, it's now widely understood and applied. So that's what I would hope we could do at the registered level as well.
I wonder if there is any feeling about the idea of a pass rate called a minimum cumulative bar exam pass rate. That sounds like a regulatory requirement, but is not a regulatory requirement as to the registered schools. And it looks like we have hands from Dean Park and Dean Clancy, but I'll turn the recognition over to Dean Keller.
Thank you. Okay, so Natalie, just teeing up, if I follow your last comment, with something for us to consider. If the proposal were to be that the unaccredited registered schools form refers to the MPR, which would be spelled out as minimum cumulative 5-year bar pass rate, that implies that's a compliance requirement when there's no proposals that be actually a required pass rate. So that would, I think that's definitely something to keep in mind. I also wonder if part of addressing the issue here might include something less than a regulatory step of changing the form and the reporting, and more allowing schools that would like to provide additional information, such as similar to the MPR, could be allowed to do that without necessarily changing the regulatory framework. But just throw that out and related to that. But I saw Dean Clancy first and then Dean Park. So let me start with Dean Clancy.
Thank you. Actually, I raised my hand to ask a question about what you just got finished commenting about, and that is the procedure that would be involved if this was to take place, meaning placing the unaccredited schools and the accredited schools in harmony as to reporting pass rates. I agree with Dean Leal that it really ought to happen so that prospective students, at least as to that factor, are comparing apples with apples. And I'm thinking that it probably wouldn't take anything other than the state bar coming up with a new section of the form for unaccredited schools that specifies how the calculation should take place, and that in that regard, that it be worded such that it matches what the accredited schools rules has in place regarding completing the BNP 6061.7 form. The accredited rules lay it out. To my knowledge, the unaccredited rules don't at all, and the accredited guidelines don't at all. But I don't know that you'd have to change the unaccredited rules and the unaccredited guidelines. Instead, just change the wording on the form. That's what I'm thinking, but maybe I'm missing something here.
Okay. Natalie, I don't know if you want to address that sort of procedural question.
Oh, it is definitely a lot more complicated to calculate. There's more work inside. We bring our research team in, we compare with schools. There's generally a lot of back and forth between. So it's a new process that we would port over to the unaccredited schools as well. Obviously, it can be done. We do it every year successfully with the accredited schools. And so we would be expanding it if that were to happen.
Dean Park.
Thank you. I just wanted to point out, given the rest of the topics we had in this meeting, certainly if there was a simpler or cost-effective thing that we could do that wouldn't really affect the review of the form in the different way, it could be keeping the form similar to how it is, but then of course schools have the freedom to present alternate calculations, their data surrounding the form as well. And I think that happens. The reason I comment on that is we do have schools with multiple regulators for different programs. So sometimes the website is already set up that way. It might not be that way for a standalone law school, but just some thought there. In terms of changing the unaccredited form or improving it, I really do think anything that's simple and that's clearly written and provides advance notice, or just, those are the three things. Something that comes to mind for me is just even with our last annual report cycle, and of course the addition of having a chance to talk to someone over data or a data analyst, that was there, that was greatly appreciated. but I remember some of the conversation from there, and just even kind of sort of the reality that even though these forms have been in existence in some time, the discussion about how each school has, student information systems with different data definitions, like that does take a lot of time, I think, to discover about each school. So what's great about at least the formula of the minimum cumulative bar passage rate, whether in presentation, it's going to have to be a statement to say, expressly, this is using that formula for Cal accredited law schools, but it's not, from the registered law school rules and guidelines. What's so great about that, at least, even though I can say as a law school, we definitely had our own ways of trying to understand that formula, is at least there is training for it. At least there are handouts about how to do it correctly. And even if staff wasn't necessarily going over the same student names as you have, just having that kind of documentation out there about what the formula is and how that data pull should be done for it to be correct is just such a service, I think, in terms of being able to pull data, like just make it worth your time to pull the data, worth the time to present the data, and to have it mean something at the end. And so I could think the only con really for a registered law school to kind of get, if they want, what's a disadvantage of, having what's currently on the BPC form become, using the NPR formula? Well, maybe they're uninterested in using a formula from the accreditation world, and they don't want that comparison. But I think from the time you last surveyed deans and now, a lot of things have changed. Even in the committee bar examiners context, the projects being discussed in relation to registered law schools has evolved a lot in the last 5 years. So I think there's going to be, I'm not speaking for all of them, I cannot, but I think there's going to be openness about using a formula from the accredited law school world, because there is that, there's a more cemented way to practice pulling that data correctly versus something that it doesn't have the same kind of backup either in, how it's written out in a guideline or a rule, or, explanatory handouts about it. The last thing I will say is going to Dean Leal's point, whenever there is a metric, and again, I acknowledge it's not part of the mandatory compliance for registered law schools, but still it would be a metric to report on that form. Whenever there is a metric being assigned, it's typical that you would want it to reflect more recent cohorts coming out of your program. So, no one is really asking for these metrics and saying, I want you to include, every graduate that can be there at your law school versus, include cohorts of graduates that reflect, they present a more recent picture of what your program has been recently for them. And I just think what is good about the NPR formula is that it pays attention that you're at least looking at some more recent graduate cohorts. Whereas if you just look purely at the bar passage rates now, especially at very small schools, it could be a mix. It just depends on who's taking the exam each time. And I think that is a weakness of why Dean Leal brought up this matter, is just because it's so open in that way. You can't look at that number we generate and say, oh yeah, and that will be fair to use to show how our JD program is working recently, or at least in the last 5 years of those who have graduated from the JD program. So I think there's a lot of pros with having a more developed formula where there's already training existing. I don't know about whether the total data check would be the same process, but I think certainly there will be a chance the schools can pull ultimately what's necessary and informative for the public if that training background and papers are there compared to status quo. So.
Okay, thank you. Dean Leal, go ahead.
Yeah, a couple points. One, I think another point to consider is, a pure adoption of the CALS NPR would include moving away from a calendar reporting 5-year period that the registered schools currently use, and then go to this, July 1st, July 31st, August 1st. Now that, line, those dates were picked because of the requirement of CALS having report in time for the staff then to then post those numbers on the website. And that's not something that, we're going to see, I think, for the registered schools. So I would agree that keeping the registered form on a calendar year basis is probably easier for schools to figure out. It's easy to know if someone graduated from January 1st of a day to December 31st. To Dean Clancy's point, I think the form could be very easily remediated to simply say that, that this metric relates to all of the school's students who both graduated and took the bar exam within the following dates, and maybe, say January 1st from 2018 to January 1st, December 31st of 2022, something like that. We wouldn't get the benefit of that 11th, administration, which I think just it does significantly complicate the analysis or the work on behalf of the schools who have an interest to capture students like that. But that's the CALs are able to do that. So I think there's a pretty easy fix at leaving it a calendar year, and two, just making that change in the definition. The next point, there was a question to you, Natalie. I didn't quite understand what you're saying in terms of any assistance that you're offering the registered schools in terms of accurately calculating and posting this number, or you would give us a number and then we would see if our records comport with that, or I'm not sure what you were referring to.
Oh, just really just porting over the current process that we use with the accredited schools. So it's a lot more complicated. The process that you use now at your unaccredited school can work directly from the pass lists as they're issued from the state bar. You've got everything you need there to go ahead and do your calculations. But when you calculate the NPR, not every individual on the pass list goes into the NPR numbers. So there's parsing that, there's comparing records. Sometimes there's adjustment as to when the graduation date has been. We have a student reported graduation date. It doesn't always match the school reported, so we double check those. We also apply the addition of the provisional licensure participation. And so all of those steps are conducted by the school and by the state bar. We verify between each other. And nearly every school has adjustments every year in order to quality check that number. And so we'd be using the same process. There shouldn't be surprises. We certainly put out the instructions about how to do it, but there always are things that we need to adjust every year.
Oh, well, thank you for that. And you raised another point, and that would be, and I guess something to discuss is the provisional, our graduates who are now members of the bar, who became members of the bar over that 5-year period, but didn't technically, quote, take the bar exam, or, so or the way the provisional process work. I guess if we got the same benefit from that, registered schools, then again, that would sort of put us on an even playing field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
Great. So just wanted to try to see if I'm hearing things correctly. I feel like I'm hearing two different things. One is, oh, we already have the NPR, so, well, it may be more complicated to check than the current calculation for registered schools. We know what the NPR process is, there are guidelines, etc. But I thought then Dean Leal said, but we we wouldn't actually want to do the same thing as the NPR in terms of the dates. We would not, I thought I heard him say, we wouldn't be doing August through July 5 years, we'd be doing 5 calendar years. So that would actually mean that it would be a slightly different calculation, and all of the current processes would have to be tweaked to reflect that different timing.
Well, I to your point, Dean Keller, I did say that, and I think I meant it in the sense, and I don't know if, and this would maybe a question for Sam, I don't think if we registered schools stayed on a, if to your point, if it wouldn't give us any competitive advantage, so to speak, if we stayed on a calendar versus the almost like a fiscal year versus a calendar year when it comes to the NPR. Although I hadn't given that any thought. I don't know if Natalie has any thoughts about that. Again, to get, if we're the goal, which is laudatory, of apples to apples, a calendar year versus a quote NPR year, might have some significant distinction. I don't know. Natalie, maybe you can address that.
I think that Dean Keller summarized it pretty well. I mean, it's just, if you're wanting to have a comparison that is direct, you would use the same time periods. If you don't have the same time periods, we would have to discuss. But at this point, we're really at a brainstorming level. So it's great to bring up anything that people are talking about. What I heard Dean Leal say is that I think he was trying to spread the workload and keep a different time period to spread what's needed rather than to spike the effort at the same time. And so we can look and see which could be better, what's the pro and con. At this point, anything that's on your mind, we should probably discuss. And then with that, if we have completed the part of discussion about the NPR, I'll talk about some of the other measures that could be considered in addition or as well. Are we ready?
I did want to have one more point about the NPR discussion. So I think to sum up what could be on the table, because again, I definitely don't feel like I speak for all the registered law school deans on this one. And this is something I definitely want to make sure they can give input on. It seems to me there are several options, and one is to keep things the same, which again, in light of some of the topics we heard before, simple, cost-effective, sort of consistent with status quo is not always necessarily bad. But I think schools do have that freedom. I mean, I know that ALU uses this on our consumer information page to post its other data studies or other data. That is something that schools can do around the form and the disclosure. So I think that's one option. It's not one I heard it somewhat articulated, but if we're going to sum up and move on, I wanted to make sure that's well articulated. And then it seemed to me a second option is really thinking about the apples to apples potential advantage there. And so, and again, I really would want anything, if there's a change, to be simple, clearly written, and with just advance notice. So maybe it is something like a swap of what was in the registered section for cumulative bar passage rate, but sort of cleanly swap to we're going to adopt the NPR formula that is used in the accredited law school rules and guidelines, for this section. But it is some language that makes it clear it's just adopting the formula. It's not, anything else. So it doesn't have other implications, because I know it's really important for the registered law schools to not confuse the public that they're not in the wrong category. So I do think maybe some thought of disclaimer language can be there in that second option. And then I guess the third option, frankly, is open to something different from those first two options, whether it is maybe someone will talk about the need that it is better with calendar years versus fiscal year. But I'm going to just say that's option 3 for now. I think that's what I heard, and I just want to make sure. Yeah, I want to make sure to articulate those if we are moving on. Thank you.
I think it's very helpful to have a summary. Dean Keller, any more comments related to the NPR before we talk about a couple of additional possibilities?
I don't have anything further. I don't see any other hands. So yeah, I think we can move on.
Okay, so I wanted to also raise 2 additional possibilities. These would not be designed to replace the NPR or the 5-year cumulative reporting, but perhaps in addition. The first, and I'll just lay them both out at once so we can discuss both. Neither would necessarily be regulatory measures, but more informative measures. The first of these would address a question that we get extremely often from students. Though the word cumulative is there, they're often confused between individual pass rates and cumulative pass rates. So one possibility is thinking about some level of individual exam pass rates in addition to the cumulative. So I'm going to say up front, all of this is in addition to what we've already talked about. Preface that to every remark that we make going forward. So that might be having 1 exam, it might be having pass rates for 3 most recent exams, perhaps 3 most recent bar and first year if it is a registered school. So thinking about having individual pass rates on the exam is one thought. The second thought is also, in addition, having something that's similar to the ABA's ultimate pass rate, not as a regulatory measure, but as an informational measure, because that's also a question that we get extremely often from students. They want to understand how CALS and unaccredited schools compare using that ultimate pass rate measure, though it is not a required regulatory measure for you. And that hasn't been raised to me as something to be considered either. So a pro would certainly be, it addresses many, many student questions. Wanted to see if it brought up any other questions or concerns to think about adding some of those things.
Yes, Dean Park, please start us off.
I think out of those 2, the individual bar pass rates is something I'm open to, as long as, and this is something that's come up in requirements for consumer disclosure forms before, we're permitted to post a link to those individual bar pass rates. I know at least for the registered law schools, there's already a requirements to have a disclosure sheet, or, often I think there is a website page where you would disclose that. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's not consistent with all law schools, but I think there's some openness to showing the bar pass rates for individual examinations, as long as you can choose to put the website link, for example, to where you update the charts, at least from ALU. In terms of the ultimate regulatory measure, I think the comment, I'm not repeating it but just something simple, clearly written, something in advance. And I think just in light of also the other things we talked about today about, so that's another formula that, I would think there would need to be training, overhead, bandwidth, monitoring, because again, it's watching for making sure the public is getting, accurate information. So I think, especially in light of what we discussed today, I don't know. I think it's something where if it was already established as a practice or a formula internally and not sort of stretching out, maybe I would think about it differently. But given how much we've discussed about what is already going to monitoring, what we're trying to know about what's going into that true cost, that makes me think this is not a time to add something that requires potentially more to the data analyst, who's, I know, already doing a lot with annual report metrics and you know, whatever might be established here if we extend the NPR training to the registered law schools.
And Dean Keller, good point. I realized that I did not describe the formula for the ultimate pass rate. May I do so, or would you like to?
You can go ahead. I would just, you're referring to the ABA test?
Yeah, so just for the purposes of the public who may or may not be familiar with this number, the pass rate cumulative numbers that the State Bar posts for accredited and unaccredited schools are 5-year cumulative pass rates in both instances, whether it's the unaccredited calendar year or the accredited NPR. The ABA uses a different measure. They call it the ultimate pass rate, and it attaches to each class. So for each graduating class, they are required to have 75% of the graduates who take the bar exam pass the bar exam within 2 years of graduation, and they have a reporting schedule for that. So each year, each class is considered by itself, and it's looked at over a 2-year period. They do also have an adjustment for the PLP program in California, or non-exam pathways in other states as well. So adding the ABA number, that's a 2-year number attached to one class versus a 5-year number attached to all takers, which is what is used right now in California. Thank you for the chance to explain that.
Sure, yeah, just that sounds so much simpler, but I know the ABA has a 14-page guidance memo explaining it, and its questionnaire is actually 7 pages long. So it's definitely way more complicated than it seems at first glance. Dean Vail, you're up.
Well, to that point, I would just point out that I think for smaller schools, and particularly distance learning and in the registered world, classes isn't as easily definable as it is in a large ABA program that, in a traditional semester kind of format where, 200-300 people graduate at a time. So I think wouldn't mesh well, I think, with some of our programs with regard to a requirement to do that. A question I have on the, if for informational purposes, this might raise more questions among students or applicants. If I haven't looked at them in a while, are you referring to posting the pass rates for types of schools, ABA, CALS, registered, in a cumulative sense, or the forms that list individual schools with their individual pass rates? And if memory serves, the problem there is my program, other small programs are not reported. They're just blanks because of I forget, is it the 9 student requirement? The statisticians, the psychometricians required, the bar, for purposes of identifying people who take or pass and fail the bar exam. So if we were to post, if we posted that, our school's not listed, and that would raise more questions, I think. And I'm surprised asking this question out loud, I don't get more questions from applicants about that who have done their homework and have actually gone to the State Bar website to look at that. And then Natalie, I think you said something about the State Bar posting pass rates for the registered schools. That's not done. I mean, you have the link to the CALs, and after they post their NPRs, that comes out and everybody looks at it. But we don't have the same level of public disclosure, I think, that certainly the CALs do.
Well,
am I right?
There's the NPR page, which only has the accredited schools on it right now. But then on the bar statistic page, you can see a pass rate by school, depending on size. It's not always shown, as you mentioned, but it is available right now. It's just in a different place that has all the schools, both unaccredited and accredited. So you raised some good points. We should talk about minimums, what it means to be able to see the minimums or not. The minimums are on the school's disclosures, but they're not on the State Bar's websites right now. So that's another good research topic to consider. Thank you.
Dean Park.
Sorry about that. I did just want to follow up after the explanation. So, and I'm definitely not the only one speaking here, but as part of our application towards a CBE accreditation. I know that I'm familiar with the forms, although I'm sure it's not necessarily the same as the official process. But if there's more added to the PLP adjustment, I'm a little leery of that in terms of, I think, time it might take to make sure to post an accurate number. And thank you for going over. There might be non-exam pathways and other state data to consider, because I was not familiar with that. And then you know, at one level, 14-page guidance memo or 7 pages long was said, it's great that the guidance is developed, but I definitely think if it's for a smaller sized registered law school, I don't know if they will go through something or the exercise. So it's a lot closer to talk over, I think, even in training or the different exceptions. I think there's already a lot to the NPR, actually, perhaps for a smaller registered law school to learn and train in, but I like that it's said, and I like that there's staff at the state bar that consistently could train or check that. I think these other things sound scary. So thank you.
I want to go back to a point that was made along the way related to individual pass rates. I'm not sure that this is directly the point, but this is something that came to me. If individual pass rates were included, would you find it helpful to have a category pass rate as a comparator along with that, versus having just your school's pass rate alone, just your first reaction to that? If we had something like, this is the total pass rate, this is an accredited, this is a registered, to give a little bit of context.
Since I still have my hand up, I'll just speak in. I'm not against that. I know the issue with manual entry, like the more you ask someone to manually enter, they don't put in the same number. So to me, I think if it's anything that's asked for, it's very clear that we're allowed to put a hyperlink to what is the fully updated information. So let's say the school is maintaining individual bar pass rates on their website, which I shouldn't assume is the practice for everyone, but it's something that we do. If I'm allowed to put the hyperlink to that, because I know that's consistently and accurately updated, and then perhaps there's a state bar link that has the more categorical rate comparisons, like that seems then a reasonable ask to me. But I think if it's, it has to be formatted into a certain table, that's sometimes where I see manual errors occur, and it's not intended, but it becomes something bad to have right on a consumer information disclosure form, just the exercise of it. So if there's just any way, if this is potentially additional information, that there is flexibility that the school can present it in a way they know they can reliably manage in an efficient and accurate way.
Thanks, that's a really helpful explanation. I was thinking about how it could offer context, but also you raised some other additional complexities that come along with it for sure.
Dean Marshall.
Yeah, Natalie, could you I want to make sure I understood what you said. The thought or vision is a school would report its required bar pass rate, for example, accredited, make up a number, 75%. And then on that form itself would be reported the average rate for accredited schools, so the student could or the applicant could compare where the school is performing within the context of its market. Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, there's not, sorry, please finish.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I'm following what you're suggesting as I reflect on all of this.
Okay, so there's not a specific proposal on the table. I mean, it could be something that is appended to the 6061 format right now. It could be a comparison table like the NPR, maybe something else not yet considered or discussed. But the goal is thinking about how many common comparators should the public have between the various choices of schools, with the idea that for most individuals, they're probably looking at all the options and then choosing which one is the right one for them. So being able to choose across all. And so we have ways that we've been doing that with success for many years, and really just looking to see, should there be a way that is easier to compare across individual pass rates, across ultimate pass rate, across harmonizing the NPR and what has been the calendar pass rate. And in particular, the NPR and calendar pass rate, the disclosures were new. And so we all were learning. We were learning with you, you were learning with us as the NPR returned to reporting in 2018. So we are just about 5 years out. So those questions happen to come up, you know, really at the right time to think about it. So it's more a goal. How do you get the information, the right information at the right time in the hands of prospective students making a choice?
Right, okay.
But yet with every piece of information you have, that's money, that's time, that's potential for confusion, and also potential to inform, and weighing them both at once.
Thank you.
Just following up on that and then thinking about Dean Park's comments about being able to just include a hyperlink. So if a school were hyperlinking to the state bar website that has the statistics for each individual bar, don't those already include the comparators that you're talking about in terms of saying this is ABA, ABA in-state, ABA out-of-state, CALS, unaccredited?
It has some of those things. It has some of those individual pass rates in a format that splits it exam by exam. It doesn't have ultimate pass rate, and it doesn't have sort of a comparison over time on a single format. But yes, right now we could go look at statistics for each individual exam across school types and across schools individually, depending on the size of the bar taking cohort.
Right, okay, yeah, and just based on what you were saying earlier about students not understanding cumulative, giving them a new cumulative measure so that they could compare with the ABA might be less helpful than just having them refer to what's already been posted and collected and verified. Okay, Dean Leal.
Well, am a little reticent, if not outwardly opposed, to the idea that our schools, both CALS and registered, should be, compared directly to the ABA schools. I mean, this is a longstanding debate that comes up from time to time. On one level, very simplistically, is the ABA minimum pass rate is a 3-year cumulative versus our the CALS 5-year, and now even the registered school. So there's nothing we could do to make that an apples to apples comparison. And I think it raises way more questions than it would answer to somebody just looking at numbers without any appreciation of the distinction. And more to the fundamental point again is we have a different regulator. We have different programs, different missions, and the like. Again, this is an old argument, and I think whenever both the CALS and registered schools, when committee staff, whoever is looking at the ABA for guidance, I think at a minimum, I think you need to be skeptical, and 2, you have to be somewhat critical to say, is that really something that's a good idea and something that's helpful in terms of what the committee is attempting to do, and it does well regulate an independent system of law schools. So I would be, this ultimate, I've heard the phrase, I guess I didn't really understand what it was. I think that's not helpful in my opinion for our purposes and for the folks that are looking at our schools as a potential place to apply and ultimately graduate.
Thanks, Dean Park.
I did have a further thought. So in terms of having comparative points Where I've seen that come up, if at all, I've seen that perhaps come up in a self-study context. For example, if you do program comparisons or things like that. I haven't really seen that in a single page or 2-page disclosure format. And so it's making me sort of rethink my input before. Well, if the concern is for those looking at the sheet as a consumer disclosure, that they need to really review that data and very much understand what our status is as a registered law school or a Cal accredited law school, I think there's a different way that can be achieved, which is part of the rules and guidelines already, which may be linking to our disclosures about our status or the nature of our accreditation. And I do think, while we want to be very protective of consumers, I think if we're giving them the disclosures that we are already required to do, and perhaps hyperlinking that in, I mean, that's supposed to always, I think, already give a consumer the awareness of how they can cross compare. Of course, I haven't seen everything, but if it's a school's individual consumer disclosure form already where they're managing that data to report, I don't think adding the calculation of an average, which I didn't think was being mentioned before, but now maybe there's that possibility. I think it's best to keep the school's task on the consumer disclosure form to the school's data. And then maybe the disclaimer, right? There are disclaimers we're already required to do that help an informed consumer know our registered or Cal accredited status. I think that's what would keep the whole, wait, like, aren't you presenting yourself like something else you aren't then discussion maybe down. And when it comes to, oh, there's an industry benchmark or there's a cross comparison to make, I've seen those more in terms of self-studies again. Maybe there is some certain benchmark point. I mean, I think the 40% is already something that the Cal accredited law schools know about as a benchmark point, but I don't think that necessarily has to be put in a consumer information form. I think that's already held and discussed in different contexts. So,
okay. Thank you. Those were the options that I had to share, Dean Keller, for now. So that concludes my questions.
Okay, great. And could you give us maybe I should have started this. Could you give us a little more context? So is this something that the CBE is seeking information at brainstorming stage at this point, and some sort of proposal might come in the future?
So this is really a brainstorming stage to get open information while we are actively reviewing the rules to see what the thoughts were. And there were some things that I expected and also some new things that I learned today that I'll bring back to the staff working on the proposals. And you will likely see something else in the future, whether it is only to affirm the status quo or to suggest something new, either for this year or future year.
Great, thank you. All right.
thank you.
So if no one else has any further questions or comments on this last item, I think we can wrap up for today's meeting.
Well, thank you everyone for a rich discussion.
Okay, great. I believe there's consensus. We don't need a motion to adjourn.
No.
So I will thank everyone for attending, and I will see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.